Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Lincoln Theater. I am Susan Bradford, and I proudly serve as General Manager of the Lincoln Theater. On behalf of the Lincoln Theater's Board Chairman Larry James, its board members, the staff, and the Community Conversation Committee, we stand here in great admiration and pride to lead Columbus community in hosting this conversation in honor of our first inductee to the Lincoln Theater Walk of Fame, Will Haygood. Just a few weeks ago, we hosted the national launch on September 29th of Haygood's award-winning book, The Showdown, the Supreme Court appointment of Justice Thurgood Marshall that changed America. In my perspective, Will has been given universal permission and ancestral affirmation to write the stories of African-American history from the human perspective that exceeds all societal barriers. His tenacity to chronicle the human perspective of success, however measured, is undeniably great. Will, as well as others, believe this piece of literary is his greatest. We selected this topic as a continuum of last month's event and to support tonight's conversations for two reasons. To acknowledge the One City, One Book Tour, Read of Showdown, sponsored by the city and the Columbus Metropolitan Library, and to create a conversation for the content of Showdown as it relates to the Voting Rights Act. Tonight, we have gathered to discuss the advancement, adversity, and the assessment of the Voting Rights Act 50 years later. My co-chair, Jack Marchbanks, who is ever knowledgeable on many topics, has assembled a dynamic panel and a multimedia presentation to support this topic. In gratitude, we acknowledge Donna and Larry James, who have sponsored this series since 2013. In addition, Ernestine Jackson, in care of AARP, has joined the Jameses in supporting this program. Mr. and Mrs. James and Ms. Jackson and AARP, thank you. I'm so happy that you are able to join us tonight. Please note that this program will be recorded live, and although we appreciate the spirit of our social sharing and the beautiful romance that we have with all of our phones, we would like to ask that you silence your devices out of respect for the speakers and the fellow audience members. So please enjoy the conversation, and thank you for supporting the Lincoln Theater. Now, it's with great pleasure that I bring to you our board member and host of WCBE Jazz Sunday, and soon-to-be doctor, Mr. Jack Marchbanks.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. We genuinely appreciate you joining us for this fourth gathering in our Lincoln Theater Association Community Conversation Series. Our timely topic for this evening is the Voting Rights Act 50 years after. You will hear insightful observations on the Voting Rights Act from two highly regarded experts on the subject, and we have some really salient points of history to share with you. But what we're most excited about is hearing from you, and we have a nice intimate group here this evening. We want to find out what your thoughts are on the still contentious issue of who is eligible to vote, when they can vote, and where they can vote. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge Alicia Healy and Howard Hurd of the Franklin County Board of Elections, who agreed to come here to register anybody who, shame on you, may not be registered to vote yet, but they are here to register anyone who's not eligible to vote here in Franklin County to vote. And they also have a sample voting machine that will test your knowledge of the Voting Rights Act. I think every panel member up here has gone through the test, and we're going to make sure that Michael Taylor goes through the test also on the Voting Rights Act. But a little historical context. And I guess, actually I do not guess, I know, on February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. And that amendment gave freed slaves and all persons of color the right to vote. That was 1870, 145 years ago. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18th, 1920. You're surprised, I know that, don't you, Michael? But that gave all women the right to vote. But Reconstruction, only a few years in, and the emergence of Jim Crow erected a thicket of barriers that altogether stripped the right to vote away from African Americans, primarily in the South. 50 years of the Voting Rights Act, advancement, adversity, assessment. It's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Eric M. Seabrook, an attorney and former Chief Counsel to Secretary of State Kenneth Blackwell. Eric.
Thank you. I feel quite privileged to be with you, and you know, even though he doesn't look it at all, you know, Herb was one of our professors when I was a college student. So obviously, I feel and someone who has tremendous insight not only on the philosophy and points of elections, but also on the actual application and operation of elections. So I really feel privileged to be on the stage with him. If I were to share with you what my perspective on this is, I would want you to first think of two words, and that would be from privilege to obligation. And I would say that both philosophically as well as in terms of actual application and how we're looking at the voting rights and where we stand now with the actual administration of voting activity. One, privilege, because particularly as an African American, all of my life we have thought of, I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, and my first opportunity to drive, as most 16-year-olds want, was to take senior citizens to the polls. So with the privilege of driving, I associated the privilege of voting. And I think for African Americans in this country, that was part of full citizenship. You know, it's part of the whole. It is both a privilege, it's a great opportunity. Sadly enough, we have not seen that privilege appreciated in the course of two, and clearly some might argue even one generation in terms of seizing it. I think that is also true for us as a country, in that the privilege of voting may well have to be looked at as an obligation. And I will, you know, kind of wrap up my comments if you hold on to that thought in terms of obligation. Getting to the mechanics, and what I think is critical about the pre-clearance aspect of what we heard of. Elections and rights, like anything else in the law, can be provided for, but then there's the question of God being in the details, in the application, in the not only approving of money, but the dispensing of money. I did some work in the Senate, and we were dealing with IT, and I was talking about how expensive it might be for us to come up with some additional equipment. And one of the members said, somebody pull him aside. And one of the staffers pulled me aside and explained to me that in the Appropriations Committee, if they had some more expenses, they just appropriated some more money. Unfortunately, it's not that simple in terms of elections. We have the right, and actually many things on the books, but then it gets down to, particularly here in Ohio, we understand it well, the actual mechanics of what's going on. And the mechanics are really what matters. It's how do we get from the right on the books to the right in terms of practice. Here in the United States, let's face it, there are a lot of people who aren't interested in certain people voting. And I mean that in a racial sense, but also in a party and a practical sense. You know, we realize that we have two parties. In Columbus right now, we're going to have a mayor's election, and it's going to be amongst people from one party, two candidates from rival camps. In the Dade County, in the presidential Bush v. Gore, Dade County was one of the key counties in Florida that impacted how that state swung. the real distinction was not Democrat-Republican. If you really look at the numbers, the real distinctions were about whites or people of European descent, and I use that term loosely, African Americans, and what we use the term Hispanic, so people of Latin descent. And even that, it may be an abuse. But I say that because it's primarily about being a Democrat. It's not about party, it's about ethnic affiliation. And really, no one was really concerned in that county about African Americans being undercounted until it made a difference in the statewide election. Why do I say that? I say that because it's about the mechanics and it's about registration and getting people out. Going to mechanics. The problem with the Supreme Court decision, to me, is one that it was disappointing because the Supreme Court has an obligation, I believe, as a lawyer and an American, to not only make rulings, but point direction with their ruling. If you say something's wrong, the question is, how do we get it right? What kind of guidance? Okay. Quite often in the law, it said that the court will not give guidance in advance. There has to be a genuine cause, a genuine problem. The unfortunate thing about the Civil Rights Act is that a formula could have been come up with. People knew that the formula was the issue long before the case. The case could have really been made moot. Congress could have come up with a formula because the argument was the formula is outdated. I mean, as most of you know, I'm sure, is that cases just don't jump up. Even though these type of cases do get before the Supreme Court very quickly, typically cases take a while to rise up. And the Congress, and for that matter, the White House, was simply not on their toes in terms of coming up with a new formula. It's much like the set-aside law we had here in Ohio for contracting. It was struck down, but it was struck down largely because the judge said the formula you've come up with, if we use your formula, you don't have enough businesses to take advantage of the contracts that would be made available. I say that from the standpoint that we have a system, a political system, where both the Democrat and the Republican Party have vested interest in seeing their people vote, their party faithful vote. And they're interested in mechanics that empower their folks. The Republican Party chairman here in Franklin County even went so far as to say, who was also happened to be on the Board of Elections, we're not interested in seeing those people vote. And you can say that he said it from a partisan standpoint. It just the tragedy was that most of the people he was referring to look like me. While it may have been a partisan statement, it was a racial statement. And that speaks to the problem with the failure in Judge Roberts' decision. It doesn't look to the practical aspect of where we live every day. The reality is that the Voting Rights Act and preclearance applies to the state of New York. You know, we like to think about disproportionate voting in terms of its mechanics, in terms of southern states and the tradition of racial discrimination, but it's just as applicable in the state of New York as it applies to disparate voting. It's a matter of equal protection. It's a matter of, does the Constitution provide equal protection for all of its students, all of its citizens, in reference to the privilege of voting, the opportunity to vote? Now, I would throw something out in terms of where we are. The sad fact is, when we're honest with ourselves, is that Americans do not appreciate the privilege of voting. We're a country where, you know, you really aren't going to, there are some difficulties in voting, and people are creating new ones. I think that if you're familiar with, hopefully you're familiar with the state of Alabama now as it applies to having a voter ID. That's been the big dispute. It was a dispute here in Ohio for a while, and our legislature seemed to get it right and figure that we didn't need an onerous ID requirement. Okay, Personally, I don't have a problem with requiring an ID as long as you give people an opportunity to get it. The problem in Alabama is that they passed an ID requirement and then eliminated the opportunity to get a government-recognized ID, i.e. a driver's license, in 29 counties. So you create a requirement and then you prevent the people from having a genuine access to fulfilling the requirement. It's in the mechanics. And the challenge is having a structure and even having funding. Many county commissioners will tell you, I've got X number of dollars. In Ohio, elections, contrary to popular perception about the secretaries of state, are county issues. They're funded and the machines are bought and paid for by county commissioners. They are administered by county boards of elections. In Ohio, there's a Democrat and a Republican. I know I'm boring a lot of you, but I'm trying to drive home the nature of the mechanics. It's homegrown activity. That's one of the other shortcomings in Justice Roberts' decision or his opinion for the court, is that it doesn't recognize the fact that it's always home cooking. Elections are about home cooking. So you can have all of the tremendous laws on the books that you want, but if you don't place a requirement, a burden, or an obligation on people to make sure they get it right, it's not going to get done. I say obligation because the question is, what's the penalty? People need to see a penalty in failing to have voter turnout. Jurisdictions need to see a penalty. And what I'm talking about now is prescriptive. And I'll tell you a story, and I won't belabor too much because, as I said, I appreciate Mr. Asher, and I don't want to rain on any of his thunder or his time. So remember I talked about privilege and obligation. County and state governments need to understand the obligation of seeing voter turnout. Right now, we put that in the hands of political parties. It's important to the Democrats or the Republicans. But, you know, if there was funding associated with turnout, we would probably see a major difference in the way elections are administered. Now, admittedly, you know, we only use election equipment usually twice a year. You know, sometimes 4 times a year, but, you know, it depends on how you define the cycles of elections. Okay, so county commissioners have said to me, and this is what I've heard personally, look, if I got to fund a county hospital and choose to put more money into a county hospital or into some election equipment, I'm putting it into the county hospital. Now, you got to remember, I was counsel while we had the most disruptive national elections in the country, and one of my things was putting together a panel to deal with choosing new voting machines across the state for how we would buy them, making them purchasable. Okay. But more critically, think about this. We are a nation that prides itself on voting, on the fact that you don't have to get shot in most places today to get to the polls, okay? It's clearly not as if it would be, say, if you were in Egypt, possibly, okay? But our people don't turn out. But imagine, I'll share a story with you. I did my master's of law in intellectual property at a small school in New Hampshire. So needless to say, being in New Hampshire, we ended up talking about politics and presidential politics. But we had 40 of our 52 students from different countries in the world. And I'll never forget, we started talking about elections and voter turnout, and one of my classmates was from Brazil. And he kind of looked at us like we were crazy. He said, in Brazil, nobody thinks about not voting. Why? Because your ability to have a driver's license, your ability to receive government benefits was tied to whether you could show that you voted. That's why I talk about obligation. If we looked at, and what I suggest and speak of is that philosophically, we have to talk about voting and think of voting in a whole nother way. We have to think of it not as just a privilege. And believe me, that's interesting because every time elections roll around, regardless of how I feel, regardless of how bad the weather is, you know, I literally think about folks in Augusta, Georgia, who told me stories coming up about putting their life in jeopardy to go vote. But the reality is I've worked a lot of campaigns and registered a lot of people all over the state, in different parts of the country for that matter. But I can tell you that we probably have two generations that care little or less about voting, particularly within our ethnic group. Sometimes you don't know whether to start to tell the young person, hey, do you understand, people died for this, people did, went through all types of suffering to vote. But imagine if certain privileges were cut off, if people didn't vote. Imagine how county administrators would behave if part of their federal funding was tied to voter turnout.
Excellent points, Eric. Excellent points. Obligation. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. All right.
Okay.
Dr. Asher.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here, and really good to see you. And we do want to get to questions fairly quickly. And the video did steal some of my lines, but that's fine. Since Eric has indicated that I am much older than him, which is really quite true, let me just make a personal comment that I grew up in New Jersey and was a teenager in New Jersey and had the opportunity to go to the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And at that convention, there was competing delegations from Mississippi. And that really was also a signature moment in terms of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what was interesting here is the power of race and racism, the power of who will have an advantage in terms of election rules and procedures. That's been an issue for decades and decades. And one of the things that just struck me, and the video referred to this, if you look at the South back in the 1950s, it was solidly Democratic, but the Southern Democratic Party was the party of segregation and repression. And yet, at the national level, the Southern members in Congress, the Southern Democrats, and the Northern Democrats could in fact compromise on issues and work together as long as you got the Southern Democrats their crop subsidies and you got them the rice and sugar subsidies and things like that. They could vote with the Northern Democrats. But there was one issue in which there was no compromise, and that, of course, was civil rights. And so it was interesting to look at election returns, and I was looking at Mississippi, and not that I want to pick on Mississippi, but it was so dramatic that in the 1950s, when the Republicans had a wonderfully popular and wonderful candidate in Dwight Eisenhower, and when he ran for re-election in 1956 against this northern liberal, Adlai Stevenson, and President Eisenhower, swept to an overwhelming re-election victory, but he lost Mississippi. And in fact, the Democrats Adlai Stevenson got 58% of the vote in Mississippi. And people were just saying, that's just amazing, it's just startling. But Mississippi was part of the deep South, the solid Democratic South. And that was in 1956. We move forward, and we have the Civil Rights Bill in '64, the Voting Rights Bill in '65, and as the video suggested, the Democrats were going to be punished for the Civil Rights Bill, even though there was bipartisan support for it. But Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner, but not from one of the Confederate states, from Texas, when he ran for election in 1964, he lost Mississippi. And he lost Mississippi by a margin of 87 to 13. Now, if that doesn't tell you the ability of an issue, and the issue was the Civil Rights Bill, to move voters, in this case white voters, because we really didn't have the Voting Rights Act yet, and black participation was very, very low. If that doesn't demonstrate the impact of the civil rights measure and race, nothing really does. But then you also look at the composition of Congress over time and our changing American politics. And if you went back to the 1950s and you looked at the 11 states of the Confederacy, so more than the Deep South, but the 11 states of the Confederacy, and looked at their U.S. senators, 11 states, 2 senators, 22 senators total, there were 22 Democrats and 0 Republicans. And if you look today, there are 2 Democrats and 20 Republicans. If you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, and I won't give you all the details here, but back in the 1950s, it was probably something like 106 to 6 Democrats over Republicans in the U.S. House from the South. And today, in fact, a substantial majority, I think it's today 89 to 28 Republicans over Democrats in the 11 states of the former Confederacy. So when you start looking at the numbers in Washington, you see that, I'm not doing cause and effect here, but you see here that the South has changed dramatically in terms of its partisan preferences, its partisan leanings, and part of that was the civil rights movement. Part of that was also perceptions that the Democrats were too culturally liberal, they were out of touch, and things like that. Part of that also has to do with redistricting patterns in the South, which actually wound up guaranteeing, for the first time in history, that there would be black members of Congress from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, etc., but that also had other consequences in terms of the broader composition. I think you were really sort of alluding to this, how people could look to their interests or whatever. So we really have had a major, major realignment in the South, and that's where we are. But now we jump forward to today, and I do wish that Sandra Day O'Connor was still on the U.S. Supreme Court, because I can think of 2 issues, depending on who she replaced, but 2 issues where the outcome would have been different, and it really reflects the point you're making here, that Sandra Day O'Connor would say, oh, I understand the law, I understand the constitutional issues, I also understand the real world and the practical application of all these things. And the Voting Rights Act would have been upheld, and probably Citizens United would never have happened, because what you had there were 2 issues that, when you listen to the constitutional arguments, they're at the least plausible for the majority. I think John Roberts made some very plausible arguments. And then you think about how the world operates and how there are so many different ways that you can tinker and tweak the election system. Election laws and election administration really make a difference. And I agree with Eric that actually, by and large in Ohio, we've gotten it pretty good, not perfect. If we have time, we'll get back to that. And Florida, going back in 2000, was the best example of a state administration of election with a lot of county option that actually changed the outcome of the election and changed who would be elected president of the United States. And I won't go into that now. But so now as we move forward, we see that in many states, and not just in the South, whether it's Wisconsin, Kansas, a variety of other states, there's really been a series of pieces of legislation dealing with voter ID, registration requirements, voter fraud, and all of that. And a lot of these pieces of legislation are pretty similar. Could there be a national movement that influenced us? Of course there was. And ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was certainly pushing that. And some of these laws were really pushed in the name of combating voter fraud. Well, it turns out that all of the studies we have suggest that there isn't very much voter fraud. There may be problems with voter registration, but that you can take care of with proper election day procedures and all of that. So we have these, and what stimulated it? And this is speculation, and I was sharing this with one person before our meeting.
You're on your own, Dr. Asher.
No, not with you. It turns out that in 2012, two good friends of mine here in Ohio said, Republican consultants said, absolutely, Mitt Romney will carry Ohio. We know that. Mitt's going to carry Ohio. And we're not sure about the nation, but we've seen the polls. We've seen Neil Newhouse's polls. And Neil Newhouse is an excellent pollster. He really is. And the Romney campaign knew they were going to win. The polls told them that. And in fact, it's speculation, but on election night, one of the reasons why it took Governor Romney a bit of time to come up with a concession speech is he had had his victory speech ready. Now, how could the polls be so wrong? And they weren't that wrong. It's just a small error would make the difference. Well, the polls totally underestimated how the turnout rate of African American citizens and young people. And as Eric said, oftentimes young people, African American voters, don't turn out at as high a rate. But the Obama campaign team had an incredible turnout machine. And so, in fact, the polls underestimated, didn't get the composition of the electorate correct, and so Barack Obama won to the shock of many, got reelected to the shock of many Republicans. And for some, rather than giving credit to the Barack Obama campaign effort, the question was raised, how did this happen? Were there people voting who shouldn't be voting? That sort of thing. And that stimulated some of the, these proposals and changes. Last point I want to make here, though, because I know we have a lot of questions, and as Eric said this, election laws and election administration really make a difference. And you don't need a lot of bad things happening to change the outcome of an election. If an election looks like it's going to be a 50-50 election or 51-49, then whether it's anything mean-spirited or just incompetent or whatever, could actually affect the outcome of the election. So I think here that the issues that are before us today, and I think here in Ohio, you know, I wasn't upset that we don't have 35 days of early voting. I think 28 now or 30? That's probably sufficient. You know, New York only has, election day voting, and here's Hillary Clinton criticizing us for reducing the number of days. I mean, that's, Hillary, please, it's a little, I love Hillary, but it's a little hypocritical. But as you talk about early voting, and we do have some consistency, but the choices you make here, what if you make it more difficult to vote on Sunday, or the Sunday opportunities are less than the weekday opportunities? Or what if the weekday opportunities are in regular business hours and not in the evening? Well, you and I know that if that's the way you did it, it would have a disproportionate impact on different groups of voters. So I think this is really what you were suggesting about the second level effects that probably the 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court didn't get. But again, I think here in Ohio, we've actually taken these issues and come up, in most cases, with some reasonable compromises.
Thank you, Dr. Asher, and thank you, Mr. Seabrook. Give them a hand. We have an august gathering here. We have Mr. Leonard Hubert, Chairman of the Civil Rights Commission, and we have a judge in our midst. So all that stated, we'd like to have people ask questions. We have two of the most qualified experts on Voting Rights Act and voting in general right here. So we're a nice, cozy little group tonight, so let's have a few questions.
One issue that is before the voters is coming up with a group in dealing with gerrymandering, having folks be appointed by parties and by the people in the community. What do you feel about that whole notion of having folks come not from political parties but be elected and to have supposedly a non-partial point of view?
I think that we should not fear experimenting. But I have somewhat of a problem with it. This is why. It's almost like merit selection of judges, okay? Or for that matter, it's as simple as voting hours or voting days. I've always had flexible schedules in all of my jobs, so I could vote any time of day. There are a lot of people who have to be at work at a certain time and got to leave work at a certain time. What I find is when we go with select committees with citizen representation, we get a narrow perspective. Most people would argue, well, now all you're getting is politicians who are a real narrow, compromised, self-centered group making the districts. And there's major concern with that. However, on the other hand, right now, like in Mississippi, we've seen our system work, okay? People don't realize, you know, we have a lot of African American, I'm biased, I talk about black folk, okay, so let me throw that out to you. It's closer to the representation of what it should be, and those districts are gerrymandered. And the court has said, you can set up a majority-minority district. I think we can always experiment. You know, that's the thing about America. It is an ongoing experiment, but we have to really think about unintended consequences. And I'm always concerned about when we make select groups, because who chooses the select groups that then are supposed to be these neutral people? To me, I almost say I'd rather have it out in the open, and we know how the politicians gerrymander the districts, and then we try and get rid of them. But, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying it. Okay?
I think Herb wants to jump in here.
Let me jump in. This proposal, the state of Ohio has been trying for decades to at least modify its redistricting procedures to try to have a little bit more balance. The way we currently do it is, for the state legislature, is we have a 5-person reapportionment board, and it's all politicians on it. It's the governor, the auditor, the secretary of state, and a legislative Democrat and a legislative Republican. So whichever party wins 2 of the 3 statewide offices controls the reapportionment board, either 3-2. Right now, the Republicans control it 4-1. And it doesn't matter whether the Democrats control the board or the Republicans control the board. What you do when you control the board is you try to screw the minority party. Both parties do that, okay? The new proposal that's on the ballot still has all elected officials, and but now there's 7, and it's saying that in order for a redistricting plan to be adopted and last for the entire decade after a census, there have to be 2 votes in support of it coming from the minority party. If there are not 2 votes coming from the minority party, then that redistricting plan is only in effect for 4 years. And so presumably that's a threat to the majority. Don't get too greedy, because if no minority member votes for your plan, then 4 years later, we're back to redoing it. And 4 years later, maybe the next time around, a different party will control the governor, secretary of state, and auditor. So this, to me, is a significant improvement. But what it's not, and we've never had in Ohio, is an independent commission, a nonpartisan commission. Ohio is a very partisan state. That's part of our political culture. Can you imagine an ethics commission that by law has 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans on it? I can, because it's Ohio and it's balanced. But couldn't you imagine an ethics commission with 6 independents on it? I don't think our political parties would like that kind of ethics commission. So I do think this proposal merits the voter support because it's better than what we currently have, but it's not the independent commission that some people might prefer.
I think we ought to try. It's worth trying and changing. And because Ohio really is a battleground state, Ohio swings. It has some problems in terms of gerrymandering, but Ohio gets it right, I think, sometimes in spite of itself. That we somehow battle it out. We go backward and forward. We have we've had more Republican governors over the last decade. It's swung Republican, but I see it swinging back. If you look at the last 50 years, there have been a couple of exceptions of one term. There have been 2 one-term Democrat governors, Governor Strickland and Governor, from Cincinnati, Gilligan. But Ohio has managed to swing back and forth, and that's part of Ohio's strength. Actually, even with the Voting Rights Act, it was Representative McCullough, a Republican out of Ohio, who was critical in getting the Voting Rights Act through. So Ohio, I think, gets it right, but it's very partisan. To your point, let's try some change, but don't be unrealistic about what we're going to get.
When the party that controls the redistricting process, here's the way they try to, pardon my language, screw the minority party. They try, and again, both parties would do this, they try to pack as many voters of the minority party into a smaller number of districts. And so the minority party wins those districts not by 55%, they win them by 70% and 80%, which means you've won them by too big a margin. You don't need to win by that many votes. And both parties would do that, but it's easier for the Republicans to do that to the Democrats than vice versa, because a core group of supporters for the Democrats is the African American community that oftentimes live in very densely populated cities. And so it's easier to do the packing there. But it's interesting as you watch the district lines and we need to add another 5,000 Democrats into this district. But again, if the Democrats had the choice, they would try to pack Republicans. When you create a smaller number of districts for the minority party that they win by an excessive amount, that means you're going to create a much larger number of districts for the majority party that they still win by a comfortable margin, but their votes are actually more effectively spread out. And so we have these very non-competitive districts. And this is a problem not just in Ohio, it's a problem in many states throughout the nation. And some people even link this to the question of polarization, because if a district is heavily Democratic, what what election matters? Not the general election, it's the primary. And how do you oftentimes win a Democratic primary? You move to the left to appeal to the Democratic activists. And so if you win that primary, you don't have to move back to the center in the general election because it's such a safe Democratic district. And to win the Republican primary, you appeal to the right because that's where the activists are. And then do you have to move back to the center? No. And so we wind up electing oftentimes Republicans more conservative than the average Republican, Democrats more liberal than the average Democrat, and then we send them to Washington or Columbus, and we're shocked that they seem to be polarized. Part of that goes back to the whole redistricting. But again, Eric's right. It'll make a small difference. It's not going to change the world, but in fact, it'll make a difference. And just the last point, in the last election for Congress, we had, if you looked at all the votes cast for the U.S. House of Representatives in Ohio, Democrat and Republican, it was probably the popular vote was close to 50-50. But if you looked at the seats, 75% of the seats, 12 out of the 16, were won by Republicans. That was a very effective redistricting. And if the Democrats had the pen, they would try to reverse that and do the same thing.
What it does, too, as it applies, particularly to African Americans, when you look at it from a national perspective, is we end up having Congress people who are in very safe districts and have a great deal of longevity, but we only get one. You know, but it minimizes the overall number, except for possibly in states like Mississippi, but even in somewhere like South Carolina, where you really should have more African American Congress people. But because you get packed into districts, in North Carolina and Georgia are similar to some degree, you get fewer African American Congress people. And that's largely because urban centers, I mean, you could probably hit 90-odd%, I used to know the numbers specifically, of African-American voters in 7 urban centers in Ohio.
Yeah, that's right. Not only do you get fewer African-American representatives, you also, in general, get fewer Democratic representatives. And so there's a trade-off here. You know, you have wonderful members of Congress, you know, like Joyce Beatty, John Lewis, and it's wonderful to have a reasonably safe district, but if that safe district means you're going to be in the minority in the U.S. House of Representatives, then...
What you get in the long run.
Yeah, that's right. Then you've lost some clout. So there's a trade-off here.
Excellent responses, Dr. Asher, Eric. Any other questions from the audience?
I've listened to you all talk for the last 30 or 45 minutes, and the people who you need to be talking to or encouraging to vote, you made a question about the people from Brazil, how it was mandatory for them to do. Well, I think that some of the issues that you're talking about would be addressed if you talk to the masses of people and let them know how important voting is to their daily life. When you tell them, if they knew how that affect, like you hear people on welfare, they say they don't vote because that's political, but they don't understand their welfare is the biggest political thing in the world. Or your food stamps, or all that. If that would come out and be told to the masses of people that we need to vote and to change some of the things that you're talking about, it would be better, because all you do is when it's time to vote, you come to the community and talk to the people above their head, and they don't see how it makes sense.
Well, you know, with I take it back to voting registration, because I've walked. I started off walking largely Ray Miller's district and registering people, and it would always amaze me how people say, "I don't do that. Or, I don't have time for that." And I'll never forget, we had a long conversation one morning talking about people who are most affected by government. I mean, government affects their housing code, their benefits, have the least degree of interest. But when it comes to property tax, people see the connection and come out and vote.
You're talking about don't have property to even know about.
Well, what I'm saying is how people associate government with their daily lives. And I think the only way you do it, this is just Eric's belief, is that you literally tie it to, if you can't show that you voted, you can't receive this college benefit. And young people are an interesting thing, because young people vote, sometimes they vote, going back to Dr. Asher's statement, President Obama turned young people out. And historically, young people have swung elections. It's not just a one-time thing.
They see how they got scholarship money if they voted, and they could get money.
But if you literally made it, like I remember knowing I had to register, I'm the son of son and nephew of Vietnam veterans. Okay, so registering for the military was, I wasn't going to Canada or anything, but it was something that was very cogent to me. I remember thinking of, was Daddy gonna come home? So that was very real, and knowing that I had to do that to receive funding to go to college, that was a very present thought in my mind. I have to ask, why can't voting be just as critical? And I think voting isn't just as critical because really the parties, both the Democrat and Republican parties, and the clip referred to it somewhat, their models are set up on certain turnout, and to some degree, they're comfortable. When I was talking about Florida, that's really what I was talking about to a degree. They're comfortable with some folk not voting because the belief is those aren't educated voters. Right or wrong, that's a perception.
Let me jump in and agree with your statement, because I think here the best way to have people vote is to have people believe that voting has consequences for them. And it's a much broader issue than simply citizens who are directly receiving government benefits. But one would hope that citizens who are receiving benefits would understand that the parties do have different policies here. But I talk to college students, and normally, students don't turn out at a very high rate. The Obama year was really sort of an exception. And when I asked them why don't they vote, especially this year, on Tuesday night I was meeting with the campus chapter of the NAACP, and we had a small number of students there, and we're talking here about voting, and well, this is not an exciting election year. And I said, well, what's on the ballot this year? Or how about for your family? What's on the ballot is city council and mayor. In your day-to-day lives, what's more important to you than police and fire protection, trash collection, and things like that? And if you have kids, how about the school system? What's more important? And yet we're going to see it. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, but at some point, too, then you start asking, what responsibility do we have in terms of our civics education? What responsibility do the media have to help really focus on substance rather than a lot of the silliness? And then also, what responsibility do the citizens themselves have? But as Eric said, put something on the ballot that really hits people directly in their pocketbook, like maybe a tax levy or an increase in the school, and then you may get people's attention. And the one time that I know of in a non-presidential year where the turnout rate among students in an odd year, not even a presidential or governor year, where the turnout rate among students was unbelievably high in campus areas was in 1983, have to go that far back, when there was an issue on the ballot to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. And let me tell you, students flock to the polls. So here's a cynical suggestion. You want students to come out and vote? Put an issue on the ballot to raise the drinking age to 22. And I'm not being serious.
People, this is it. People are self-centered and really, and for me, I mean, it may be kind of Machiavellian, or some people might say it might be low-minded, but it's in no one's financial interest to sometimes see more people turn out or to change the models. I mean, I lost a job one time. I went before a group of people, a commission in Washington, and I told them, I said, look, I want to be real honest with you. You have to define success very low for this commission, because neither one of the parties is interested in seeing the voting models change. And I said, we can like it or dislike it, but the models have been developed, and there are people who have a financial interest in turnout. And I believe people are fundamentally motivated by things that are self-centered, and particularly when it has to do with money or resources. And if it can't be explained in those terms, in almost a Pavlovian level, people aren't going to act. And that might not sound nice. And also, I think there are people who are interested in discouraging people from voting. I mean, we forget that sometimes, that there are people who seek to confuse the issues, seek to suggest to people that their vote doesn't matter, okay? So if it rains or if it snows or whatever, you know, why make the extra effort?
And Eric, I'd like to leap in there and just ask one question that's related to that point of discouraging people from voting or limiting voting. With the Citizens United decision, what you look at with all the money that's in the elections and the carpet bombing ads that go on, rather than speaking to the issues that our last questioner pointed to, the things that make sense that would encourage people to vote, isn't the lion's share of money that comes from these unaccountable groups who are funded by virtue of Citizens United focused on negative ads that actually have the impact of discouraging the vote? Dr. Asher, Mr. Seabrook, can you respond to money in politics and how that's impacting everything? We know demographics are impacting it, but the money.
The first part of your question is quite correct, that disproportionately those ads are very negative. It's not to support a candidate, it's to attack another candidate. But the research is actually very mixed about how much it actually depresses turnout. Because in some cases, if you can get voters so angry about the other side, then people may come out to vote for maybe not the most accurate reasons, but I think a lot of us, though, believe that all this negativity in some way, though, diminishes people's sense of confidence in how politics works in this country. And I think that's a concern.
I think money, and this is very schizophrenic, money matters about candidates, it matters less about issues. You know, I'll give you an example. People in this town voted down. Let's think about, you know, let's apply it to Columbus, Ohio. Let's think about the zoo levy. Let's think about the stadium, the arena, okay? People sometimes vote stuff down, and it doesn't matter how much money you spend on it. It's just, hey, we're not buying. One of the things, and you know, and I've been critical of him, but one of the things I hand to President Obama when he's talking about banning civic funding of arenas, okay? Citizens have voted that down time and time again, but it manages to come up because there's a lot of money behind it. But money when it comes to individual campaigns for candidates, I think is a different story. And that's where the real issue comes in, because when we take pot shots at a person's integrity, it's a lot harder to build that up. But people are smart. You spend a lot of money and still lose on an issue.
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
and in Columbus, we had multiple arena issues. We had last time, the downtown zoo issue and cultural facilities. We had,
Was it the tax?
well, actually, the most recent school levy. Because, in fact, and that in part, and I think what you're saying is really quite accurate, quite right, that in a lot of those issues seem to be that there were people telling us, here's what's good for you, but you pay for it. And you didn't need a lot of money to fight. Yep. And so that's actually good news. We'll see on the marijuana issues, because the side that wants you to vote no on 2 and yes on 3 has a lot more money than the other side. And we'll see what happens there. My guess is money will not carry the day.
Any further questions from the audience?
I don't have a question but a comment. We need to look at Canada, because the Inuits of Canada, the Indians came out, and they were unexpected to have their input, but they got Trudeau, who was a conservative, who's a liberal, over the 10-year conservative of their current government, and people were really shocked at how the natives, the Inuits of Canada, went out and changed and got Trudeau over a well-heeled, 10-year, full of money liberal group.
But black voting, I'm waiting to see when the Somali community or one of the immigrant communities in Franklin County turns an election. You know, I don't think anybody has effectively learned how to marshal or move those communities, but theoretically, one of those communities could flat out decide if they voted as a block, and I think there's more potential there, could easily control Franklin County. Could be the difference in Franklin County. There was something similar to that in Georgia. You had a long-term governor he outspent his opponent 10-1 and lost 2 elections ago. So it's something to think of.
You know, as you think about blocks at the national level, probably the most significant, even though it's a much more diverse group, it's not a monolithic block, but the Hispanic vote is still an under-mobilized vote. Other minorities, such as African Americans, are far more mobilized and participate at a higher rate. And so one of the imponderables this year, and again, the Hispanic community is quite different. It's Cuban, it's Puerto Rican, it's Central American, it's Mexican. But one of the questions is, will the rhetoric and tone of the Republican presidential nomination battle lead to making the Hispanic vote more of a bloc and more highly mobilized, and then more loyal to the Democrats, because they're not overwhelmingly Democratic by any means yet. And so that's really, that would be an interesting thing to see if that parallels some of the things that happened in Canada.
Jack.
Yes.
Not a question, but just a comment. The last questioner, I believe, stated where the problem lies, in both Eric and the professor indicated as well. It's the civic engagement, the responsibility of the people. And that's what's missing, because if you listen, as Eric would say, the mechanics, we had a great mechanics discussion tonight. We have a great mechanics discussion every time I turn on the TV, whether it's the national news or whether it's the state news. We got the pundits from both political sides discussing, and their discussions are only based on trying to get folks to do what they want them to do, not what the masses or what the people would do. Because one of the things that really I thought was was, although we pride ourselves in Columbus being the 15th largest city in the country, and we got this, we got the Buckeyes, and we got this, and we got that. The primary election this year in the city of Columbus, 15th largest major city in the country, was determined by less than 10% of the voting populace, and nobody has been talking about it. Nobody. And everyone, and each of us in this room, and every citizen in Columbus and in the state of Ohio ought to be sad about that, because less than 10% of the people is deciding who your executive is going to be to run your city. That's sad.
And just stealing one of Eric's lines, there might be people who don't have a great incentive to want that percentage turnout to be 70%. I
disagree with that.
Oh, I agree. I agree with you. No, I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I think you can look at different,
Let's answer a question. Who is they?
well, as it applies to voting and interest in voting turnout, I think there are different people from election to election. Let me give you an example. I use Dade County as an example. African Americans voter turnout has been underrepresented in Dade County for years. It was never an issue until that lack of turnout impacted the statewide taking of the election for a presidential candidate. I'm sure if they had to do over again, the Democratic Party would say we need to mobilize Dade County and make sure Dade County is ready to go. But it just was never an issue because they always knew that they were going to win Dade County. So African Americans not turning out was not an issue. As it applies in general today, some people have an arrogant attitude. So they is many different groups. Some people believe that a lot of people do not intelligently exercise their vote. There are a lot of civic groups, okay? And I don't want to name one because I don't want to blame, but there are civic groups that believe some people don't study and we ain't concerned about them going to the polls and voting because they're guessing or they just don't know a lot.
What they've called low information voters in the media.
Okay. And most of us are like that about judges. I'm a lawyer and I can tell you that I voted for a few judges and I really didn't know what they stood for.
Amen.
Most people.
We have a judge.
I was just getting ready to say my comment is that, most people want to go to vote around pocketbook issues, about, things are going to help them to create income for their families. Most people don't go to vote just for entitlement things that are going to keep them, for lack of better, to keep them dependent upon something that's considered an entitlement. People want jobs. We don't have an industrial policy in this United States about how to create jobs for people. We just don't have that. In fact, we have less of it now. People that feel like there's no reason to vote for a politician because they're not talking about how jobs are going to be created, they become lethargic and they don't go vote. I've seen that, in my years when I've gone out to, talk to people and do voter registration, and you ask them, if they're going to vote, and they say, no, I'm not going to vote, I need a job. That's their primary focus is about, I don't want you to take care of me. Yeah, I want to contribute to providing services that we all take advantage of, like things about how our infrastructure and our roads and that we all commonly use and take advantage of. But I want to be able to work and provide for myself and my family. I don't want somebody else to be able to depend on somebody else to take care of me. And I think that's mainly where I see a lot of lethargy, especially with African American voters. They just don't feel like there's any jobs out there for them. And then we have the education situation we know that education leads to greater job opportunity. So there are a whole host of things that underlie all of this voting Yeah, I do agree, and with you, that there should be some sort of an obligation to vote. You know, in places like Australia, there are other countries where there is an obligation to vote, and there's higher level of participation. And I don't know what the outcomes are in terms of their civic life, but I'm sure I haven't heard anything about. Can you speak to that? In other countries where there is an obligation, actual obligation to
I'll let the good professor respond, and then I will respond.
I'll respond to two things, but just imagine now that you and I were to propose mandatory voting, because that's what you're really talking about here. And no, that's exactly the point, that we're going to propose mandatory voting, and some countries actually have, in effect, fines if you don't vote. Other countries, as I recall, maybe Italy, they stamp your papers, right, so that if you voted, it indicates that, and that way when you deal with the bureaucracy, you get better treatment than if you didn't vote or whatever. But let's just imagine now that you and I are proposing mandatory voting in the nation. How quickly would that recommendation get caught up in people's, politicians' perceptions of who's going to benefit by that and who's going to get hurt by that? And I think we can guess immediately that the conservative wing or the Republicans might say, no, that's just a plot by the Democrats to make sure they're going to win every election. And that would then be an example of, well, maybe, you know, that we asked before, who doesn't want people to vote? Well, it's not that you don't want people to vote. You want your side to vote, and if the other side doesn't vote, that helps you. So the other, can I just do a 180 here? I agree with you what you're saying about, you know, the jobs and all that. But one thing I would wish is that when we ask, let's say, an Ohio State student, a Columbus State student, the following question: how does government impact you? That there would be some answers rather than saying, well, I really don't know. And I'll say, well, are you going to a public university? Does state support affect your tuition? Did you go to a public school? You know? Do you drive on public road? You know, and somehow having that, but then really adding to it what you were saying, that somehow the linkage between your aspirations and perhaps government helping in terms of providing the infrastructure or the superstructure, whatever it is. I think those are the ways you'd want to go.
In response to that, two aspects. There are 22 nations in the world that have compulsory voting. In some of those nations, you may actually do some jail time if you fail to vote. In Brazil, where I'm most familiar because of my classmate, are there things like your taxes, your property taxes may well change if you can't show that you voted, okay? Certain government jobs you cannot hold if you have not voted. So there are very measurable challenges. In terms of jobs and voting, the classic example are casinos all over the country. Casinos always get voted in on the premise of job creation, which they never deliver. If you study casinos around the country, they've never delivered the jobs that they've promised. And I don't know if that's a measure of whether they're necessarily good or bad economic stimulators, but I know they never produce the jobs that they suggest. But I almost had a lady punch me during early voting when I was talking about voting no on casino gambling, because she said it's going to give an opportunity for me and my daughter and my granddaughter to have some jobs.
We'll let the woman on the stage have the last word.
Thank you. Just wanted to kind of recap the discussion and some of the things that I've heard, privilege, an obligation, the definition of who is they, civic engagement, modeling or suggesting that we take an observation of other countries that have consequences to us not voting. Understanding that this generation is not as connected to the privileges and the benefits of voting. For me, it was never an option or a question in my family because the grandparents who could not vote lived right in my household. And then the ones who could vote and was a part of the 65 Voting Rights Act made it very known of our obligation and our privilege and our benefit to that. I want to thank our audience for their questions and also for their comments. Want to thank Dr. Asher and of course Attorney Seabrook for sharing their experience and their studies and research on that. Of course, the Lincoln Theater continues to have conversations that delves deep into conversation. We don't want to stop the conversation. We really want you to continue this, your thoughts and your ideals, continue them on after we leave here today. We would also like for you, if you're new to our conversations, to make sure you stay connected with the Lincoln Theater. We have our cards there at the end. Again, just thanking all of you for coming out. And again, the wonderful Mr. Jack Marchbanks as our moderator. The Lincoln, thank you. The Lincoln Theater staff and board. So thank you and have a good night.